ambassador who is waiting for our special guest, let aside SRSG, namely the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland. And many thanks also to all colleagues for being here. This event is organized today together with the European Delegation to the United Nations in New York, and I'm very happy to have my dear colleague here, Ambassador Silvio Gonzato, who will then also deliver some remarks. We will change a bit the order of speakers. I think I will invite first, I will start with some introductory remarks on behalf of the European Union, and then I will invite Mrs. Gamba to deliver a keynote speech. It will then be followed by, I hope, a very interesting panel. You see the names of the panelists here. I will invite them then to take the floor. Following this panel discussion, we will dedicate around 20 minutes for an interactive discussion here. I already have a list of 12 speakers, and I would invite everybody to be short from the speaker side. Closing remarks will be delivered first by the Deputy Permanent Representative of Poland to the UN in New York, and then by the Deputy Permanent Representative of the EU Delegation, here by Ambassador Silvio Gonzato. Voilà. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I will start with some introductory remarks for today's event here, which is focusing on a world where conflicts are unfortunately on the rise. Among the vulnerable population, children around the world suffer most. They suffer most of the consequences of conflicts and humanitarian crisis. We think of Ukraine, obviously, but not only. We also think of Cameroon or of Syria, to name a few, where children are unfortunately still deprived from education. They are exposed to violence, physical and psychological suffering, lives of poverty and social injustice. And the chance of education of a decent life is greatly diminished. Humanitarian emergencies all around the world do not only condemn the current and future generations, but they are also depriving the entire world of the invaluable capital of knowledge and creativity. Let me look a bit at Africa. In the Central Sahel, over half of the children have reported feeling unsafe at school. Attacks and threats against education contributes to feelings of stress, which hinder children's abilities to learn. And additionally, there is a security situation that has led to over 5,500 schools shutting down in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. Of course, when we talk about children being deprived from schools, we also think of Afghanistan, obviously. And there, frankly speaking, children and girls are not yet back to school. We have 60% of those that are not back to schools that are girls. So the gender dimension is obviously a very important one. And I remember yesterday the excellent launch of the paper looking at the gender dimensions when it comes to children in armed conflict, and where I was very honored to deliver some remarks on behalf of the European Union. Now, obviously, we cannot have this event without thinking of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has a devastating impact on many different aspects of our daily lives, of course also on the children. 7.5 million children are impacted with 928 attacks on education facilities, according to OCHA, and with over 500 educational facilities damaged. We see nationwide in the Ukraine school closures, putting the education of 5.7 million school-aged children and of 1.5 million students at risk in Ukraine. And some Ukrainian children are, of course, also refugees. What we have done as European Union, and this is our member states that have done that, We have opened classrooms to children from Ukraine. We have opened through the School Education Gateway platform and EU Education Solidarity Group for Ukraine from the EU side. We are providing information but also educational support to ensure students inside Ukraine and newly arrived in EU member states can access online educational resources in Ukraine. And we are closely working with our 27 member states to support identifying and recruiting Ukrainian teachers. Globally, 426 million children and young people live in fragile and conflict-affected areas. This is a huge amount. And an estimated 35 million children are forcibly displaced. Adding the current COVID-19 or post-COVID-19, hopefully, pandemic setting, vulnerabilities that already existed are being reinforced. Preventing the loss of a generation from education in conflict, but also in post-conflict situations, is not a new challenge, but clearly a priority for all of us. We also know that the challenges to protect the rights of the child are huge and need a collective response. And here you know that we as the European Union, we are committed to ensure the right of every child to protection, to education, but also to a normal life, as we have reiterated the recently adopted EU's strategy on the rights of the child. You also know that the European Union is regularly running a resolution, one of our oldest by the way, on the rights of the child. And this is something we do not do alone. We do this together with an important region of the world, which shares not just our values, but the universal values, namely the Latin Americans. Just to add a couple of more numbers, in 2021, so last year, the European Union provided 146 million euros to address access to safe and quality education for over 2.3 million children. This adds to over 90 million euros provided to child protection in humanitarian settings. We also supported projects aimed at mitigating and responding to violence against children, as violence soon became a shadow pandemic, unfortunately. And of course, we also provide support to another challenge we are currently facing, namely to the challenge of unaccompanied and separate children, and children associated with armed forces and groups. Likewise, we need to be strategic, that's a sentence I usually do not like to say, but because it's so easy to say this sentence, but you will understand what I mean, in terms of combining our humanitarian development and peace-building strength. So it is basically about the nexus, and about combining different aspects when we talk about peace and security, when we talk about human rights development, and related aspects such as current humanitarian crisis. What we require here is a collective response, because we have a collective responsibility to make sure that no one is left behind. And this is, I think, now the time where I will invite the Under-Secretary General, SRSG, it's still not easy to pronounce, Virginia Gamba, to deliver her remarks, her keynote speech, which will then, I see that the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland is coming.
Maybe we can correct them.
Yeah, so then maybe I would suggest to keep the order. Is that fine with you, USG? Yeah, so warm welcome to the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, Piotr Gliński. Hello.
Sorry for being late.
You're just in time.
For the speech.
Absolutely, you're just in time. I just mentioned your name. I'm from the European Union, and I realized that I didn't present myself very impolite. My name is Christina Kokkinakis, and I'm the new Deputy Director General for UN and Human Rights back in Brussels. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here. This is what my script says. Prime Minister of Poland, Piotr Gliński, to invite you to deliver your introductory remarks, and your remarks will be followed then by the keynote speech of USG, Virginia, Voilà. I'd like to microphone. I will hand over the microphone. This is what I was told. Please.
Welcome, everybody. Sorry for being a little bit late, but we have had another duties are always during such visits, important visits. Ladies and gentlemen of the United Nations member states, from more than 2 months, we witnessed the drama of the war in Ukraine unfolding before our eyes. The war triggered by the brutal Russian aggression on Ukraine. Not only the life and health of the Ukrainian nation, but also their culture and therefore their identity and future of the youngest generation are in mortal danger. We, the witnesses, sensitive and righteous individuals, should not look comfortable at the destruction of the still young statehood of this country, accompanied also by demolition of the structures of the nation and society that is deprived of the fundamental human rights. It is our moral duty to act. It is our duty to oppose the aggressor and in all possible ways and to support the Ukrainian nation, both those who correctly defend their homeland and those who desperately seek refuge from the area of warfare. I would not hesitate to state that this war exposed the entire paradigm upon which our civilization was founded, and the existence of a very nation depends on the patriotism of their citizens based on a commodity's readiness to defend itself, to make the ultimate sacrifice, that of one's life for one's homeland. And it is this patriotism, this love of one's homeland to the bitter end, something entirely out of fashion elsewhere nowadays, that is driving the Ukrainians in their successful resistance. Their cultural identity and cultural background are what makes them capable of making sacrifices for their homeland, while others fail to do so. The intensification of the Russian offensive in Ukraine has disastrous consequences for everyone. The war destroys, takes away dignity, separates families, maims and kills. The military aggression is having a devastating impact on the country's 7.5 million children. Thousands of children have died in Ukraine since February 24, and many have been injured. Over 1.5 million of the youngest fled the country. In terms of scale, this refugee crisis is unprecedented since World War II. Unfortunately, like all children who have to leave their homes as a result of wars and conflict, Ukrainian children are also at risk of lacking access to education. Considering the broad aspects of the negative impact of Ukrainian children as an outcome of the ongoing war, we cannot idly look at the situation. Large-scale support for the continuation of quality education of all affected children in Ukraine and in refugee-hosting countries is critical to prevent the loss of a generation. Remembering this cruel injustice affecting the youngest and the most vulnerable, Poland tries to compensate the losses suffered by children from Ukraine who find shelter in Poland ensuring their continuity in education. The Polish system of education has been always open for pupils and students from other countries. Before February 24, 2022, Poland has already had relevant solution to welcome and support foreigners in Polish schools and higher education institutions. Nevertheless, we have introduced further measures to make our system even more flexible in order to facilitate the large and sudden influx of refugees from Ukraine into the Polish system. After February 24, 2022, the information about students who came to Poland from Ukraine is updated daily. Currently, almost 200,000 Ukrainian refugee children are already in Polish schools. 20% of them in preparatory classes, 80% of them in regular classes together with Polish children. The choice of the most appropriate educational solution for children and pupils who have arrived from Ukraine remains within the competence of the parents or person having custody of a child. There are some orphans, there are people without families, and they have two options in providing education. We also passed a special law to establish this possibility to be responsible for children without parents. And it works. So they have two options in providing education. First, continuation of education in the Ukrainian system using distance education methods and techniques. And second, enrolling in a school operating within the Polish educational system. To enable distance learning for the students, the Ministry of Education and Science is implementing the School for You initiative, which has already collected several thousand pieces of computer equipment, which has been distributed to children from Ukraine studying online at schools in Ukraine. Students from Ukraine in the age of compulsory schooling and compulsory education in Poland, between 7 and 18 years, are admitted to public schools and are provided with care and education under the condition applicable to Polish citizens. Ukrainian students who do not speak Polish are provided within several options, like participation in additional classes in Polish language or studying in preparatory classes. Ukrainian citizens may be employed as teachers without a work permit, under the same requirements as a citizen of Poland. There's a rule in Poland, we passed a special law, that Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian war refugees, they have the same rights like Poland. Polish citizens, they have access to all services, I mean the social benefits and also education, of course, and some others. Poland is doing the best we can to help Ukrainian children in those troubled and terrifying times, offering them safety at our homes in Poland, among our families, and a kind of normal life. With its duty and joy, we hope that we are able to save at least part of their dreams and childhood. I sincerely hope that this war will come to an end soon, and despite traumatic experiences, these children would be able to join their families and friends and go back to their homes and schools in free Ukraine. I was there, I was in Kiev, in Borodyanka 2 weeks ago. I watched, I witnessed this war on my own eyes, and we are even more focused on help and assistance for those people and for Ukrainian nation. They are fighting for us. They're fighting not only for Ukraine, they're fighting for Poland, for Europe, for the whole world, for the civilization. And it is our obligation to be involved in this action to support their efforts, to survive, and the effort, which means importance for everybody, because this is our common interest, this is the interest of our civilization, to win this war and to support Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. I will now invite, as said before, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Virginia Gamba, for Children in Armed Conflict. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you. Preventing lost generations, ensuring continuation of education in conflict situations. It's such a big sentence. But I think from what I've just heard from the moderator that introduced from the EU, and we just come to hear from the Deputy Minister, there are many dimensions to this. And it just made me think a little bit. As you know, I'm Argentine. In Argentina, we have over 6 million refugees from Venezuela. In Argentina alone, there are about 700,000 that are already in schools in our country and have been given special work permits to be able to work. The same thing in Peru, in Ecuador, in Chile, in Bolivia, in Paraguay. Latin America has generously provided for those that were living one country in distress. But then in my docket, I have a similar situation in Asia, where I have so many refugees escaping from Afghanistan in the neighboring countries, most notably perhaps in Pakistan, and we're talking of millions of people. In Myanmar, which is in my docket as the CAC docket, as you know, from 2017, over 760,000 Rohingyas, most of them children and women, escaping to Bangladesh, where they still are in Cox's Bazar, sometimes devoid of much assistance. And if we start talking about the least, I mean, I can think of Turkey remains the country with the most refugees escaping from the Syrian conflict, and Greece also has got its fair share of this. Within Africa itself, people don't understand or know that even South Sudan today is hosting lots of refugees from Ethiopia. We have got so many people, families, young people, unaccompanied young people that are actually trying to move towards something else. So I wanted to start there to say, Europe, you're not alone. We are accompanying you with the rest of the world. And in a way, this gives us a common ground to better assess the importance of not losing any more generations across the world. I think this is something that I want to really undermine our remark here. The second bit of information, I was 2 weeks ago in Latin America. I was exchanging with the interim director of the Economic Community of Latin America. And we were discussing the impact of COVID-19 on schools. And right now, the estimate of the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean is that the 2 years where schools were closed in Latin America because of COVID-19 will take 25 years to recover. 25 years. It's a whole lost generation out of just 2 years of COVID contacts. Now, talk of a double whammy. Ukraine comes after COVID. And so that's a lot of the crises we're seeing today in Africa and in Asia, including in Afghanistan. So we're not just talking of this year. We're talking at least of 3 years that will take a massive effort to recover these lost generations. So I thought it appropriate to start with this feeling of a common ground, a common challenge that we must meet together. I really think that the European delegation and the Polish mission and UNICEF were brilliant in organizing this possibility to discuss these issues with some urgency, to look at safeguarding education in situations of armed conflict. But I also think it's not just armed conflict. It is my docket, but I think it's bigger level of violence. I think in times of crisis, the life-saving role of education for children can never be underestimated. It's the one safe space for children is education, is school. So we have to think the last 3 years, have we been able to provide that safe space? And what can we do now in this evolving situation to provide safe space, particularly in relationship to Europe and Ukraine? Despite being condemned as one of the 6 grave violations against children in times of conflict and a gross violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, attacks on schools and on protected persons in relation to schools remain widespread in several contexts, with devastating impacts on children. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools, are strictly prohibited under international law, which is also why the non-military use of schools is so important. And I want to commend the Safe Schools Declaration, because it's equally important to keep schools safe for children. Whether they're empty or not is immaterial. They should never be used for military purposes. Any attack on education is an attack on a child's right to live and to thrive. But beyond being a fundamental right for children, education is also a foundation for sustainable peace, stability, and development. In 2020, the United Nations and our monitoring and reporting mechanism has verified 536 incidents of attacks on schools and related protected personnel in 21 situations of conflict and concern in my docket. The 2021 annual report has not been released yet. It will be released next month, but I can already share with you that attacks on schools and attacks and threats against personnel and students of schools have continued totally unabated, depriving thousands of children from accessing education and further weakening already very fragile educational systems. Over 100 schools and hospitals were attacked throughout 2021 in Afghanistan, and close to 1 million girls that are above 6th grade, ages between 14 and 18, it's about 1 million, are prevented from receiving an education in violation of their fundamental rights this year. Also in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Syria and Somalia, hundreds of schools were not operational due to attacks, threats of attacks, and general insecurity, depriving children of an education and further exposing them to violence. In Cameroon, education personnel were threatened and schools were burned down. In the Central African Republic, school material was destroyed or looted, and schools were militarily used by parties to conflict, depriving children enrolled at those schools from attending classes or forcing them to enroll in different schools, if possible. I am particularly worried about the information, as was mentioned here, on growing numbers of attacks on schools' infrastructure in Ukraine. In many contexts, attacks against schools are often committed in conjunction with other grave violations such as abductions or the recruitment and use of children. In addition, threats against the right to education continue long after conflict, as explosive remnants of war, mines, and other unexploded devices placed in or near schools on purpose continue to endanger children around the world, often preventing them from resuming a much-needed education, even if peace comes. I mean, look about Mosul. We cannot even bring the children and families from Syria to Iraq to occupy the spaces they had before because the land is contaminated with mines, perhaps the most in the world, and no one yet is thinking of clearing that before the children can come back. Since the creation of my mandate 25 years ago, the UN Security Council has adopted 3 resolutions on children and armed conflict, dedicated specifically to the protection of education. The resolutions 1998 of 2011, 2143 of 2014, and more recently 2601 of last year, sponsored by Niger, which I believe is here together with Norway. With these resolutions that form the normative backbone of the mandate, the Council urged all parties to conflict to refrain from actions that impede children's access to education and called for member states to take concrete measures to deter the military use of schools. The consistent high-level advocacy of myself and my predecessors contributed to promoting the Safe Schools Declaration, an instrument that is now endorsed by 114 countries who have committed to better protecting education in situations of conflict. The full and unequivocal implementation by all state parties of these resolutions is a critical element of protecting education. Also, endorsing and implementing the Safe Schools Declaration and ensuring that all necessary measures are taken to prevent and respond to attacks on schools during armed conflict is imperative towards safeguarding education. When civilians, especially children and civilian infrastructure, become part and instruments of conflict, it is our entire societies, as mentioned here this morning, that are suffering. All parties to conflict, wherever they are, must also refrain from using schools for military purposes, abide by the obligations under international law, and prevent attacks against education facilities, as well as other civilian infrastructure and protected personnel. Preventing attacks against schools under military use in the first place is key to protecting education. While progress is substantial from the side of the international community to establish an enabling environment for the protection of children and their education from attack, more must be done for the millions of children who are still out of school due to fear, insecurity, discrimination, and threats in situations of armed conflict. States should include measures to end and prevent attacks against schools in all their domestic legislation, including the criminalization of these acts, and they must hold perpetrators to account. During conflict, rules of engagement must include measures to avoid attacks in populated areas. International humanitarian law, especially the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, must be fully respected as armed conflict spills in and around schools. Moreover, military use of schools must be prevented by issuing clear military orders to that effect and including its prohibition in military manuals and doctrine. While engaging parties to conflict in support of peace processes or the development of joint action plans to improve the protection of children and stop grave violations against them, it is imperative to advocate for accountability and compliance with international law, ensuring respect for child protection standards is universally upheld. In this regard, action plans between the UN and parties to conflict are a key tool to change behavior and facilitate long-term structural advances in societies, placing the welfare of children at the heart of dialogue. To conclude, children themselves have made practical recommendations presented during the 4th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration last fall in Nigeria about what would make them safe in getting to and from school. And we should listen to what they have said. It is written, it's out there for you to read. What they're saying are recommendations that include to ensure the paths that children travel are safe and free of mines and explosives, and that they do not cross where armed groups or military bases or checkpoints are located. They ask and encourage governments to provide quality education that allows children to complete their full education cycle close to home, particularly for children living in rural areas, as needing to leave their communities to complete their education. Children are more prone to giving up school, and this could make them more vulnerable to recruitment. Finally, children express that governments must help children who have been victims of war with professional psychological support to help them overcome the trauma. They thus today recommit to the protection of schools and therefore education from any type of attack, and remind ourselves of the need to respect children's right to an education free from violence and coercion that benefits all children without discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. It's now an honor for me to invite the panelists to join me here on the floor. I would like to name them shortly for you. First, Mr. Fontaine. Director of Unicef, Office of Emergency Programs. Welcome. I would like to invite Ambassador Bixuimani, a Deputy Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations. Ambassador Omar Hossein, Deputy Permanent Representative of Bangladesh to the UN. Director Yasmin Sherif from the organization Education Cannot Wait. Please take a seat. And I will also invite the Deputy Permanent Representative of the of this house of the Polish mission to the UN, Mateusz Zakovic. Well, with that, and in view of the fact that we are running already a bit late, I will ask the panelists to be as short as possible, while at the same time delivering, of course, their main messages. Just to introduce Monsieur Fontaine, you have more than 25 years of experience with UNICEF, both managerial but also technical leadership, and in both development but also emergency contexts. You have served as UNICEF Regional Director of the West and of Central Africa Regional Office, and you held positions such as a Senior Advisor of Child Protection in New York, Deputy Permanent Representative to Afghanistan, Somalia, and Albania, and also Head of Office in the Western Balkans in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, now it's more than 30 years. It was, you do those bios and you need to update them from time to time. So I've said it. Anyway, I'll be very brief and just make a few points for the discussion. One is I really wanted to start from the same point that the SRSG made earlier, which is unfortunately the education crisis is not just an armed conflict crisis. And it is estimated that 70% of 10 years old in low and middle income countries actually are not able to read or comprehend a simple story. 70% of 10 years old. So that's really high. And that's an increase from 50% before the COVID crisis. So that just gives you a sense. Globally, 131 million school children in 11 top countries have actually missed most of their learning from March 2020 to September 2021. They're in-person learning at least. So that gives you a sense that, again, the learning crisis is not just an armed conflict crisis. But yet, of course, armed conflict is yet another factor that actually limits learning. And as the SRSG mentioned, I think we are close to 1,000 verified incidents of attacks on schools and the major use of school last year. And then, of course, we know the situation in Ukraine. According to the Ministry of Education, I think it's more than 900 schools that have been actually damaged or destroyed. But then again, it's not only Ukraine, and in Burkina Faso in 2021, we had actually more than 2,200 schools closed due to the insecurity and the conflict. So that gives you this, and that affects about 300,000 children, so 300,000 children not able to attend schools in those situations. So I think we all agree about that, that armed conflict disrupts learning, that learning is extremely important. But what we want to say as well is that schools are not just important for learning, they're actually important for many other things. One is they do really provide a safe space that is actually brings some time of normalcy and routine to children. And I can tell you, traveling around the world in many conflicts, how much children actually insist on going to school, including children who have access to actually distant learning, really want to go to school because they like that moment, that socialization, that routine, that impression of normality that is so important in situations of armed conflict. Education can also, of course, be a lifeline for us because this is a place where we can teach children about mine, about risk of explosives, remnants of war, where we can start to address their psychosocial well-being, and so where we can actually pass them a lot of message, work with them, and help them in many ways. And of course, in many cases, schools can actually protect children from other dangers, such as recruitment, and when we work with the teachers to avoid recruitment, as we're doing, for example, in countries like Colombia. But of course, you can also provide water, you can provide food, you can provide hygiene, you can provide knowledge. It's so important to protect yourself. So schools for learning, but schools as an environment that is a protected environment for children. What we've learned, we've been, as you know, UNICEF for years, we've been trying to keep children in schools and make sure that children keep learning during conflict. And we've learned a few things. So I just wanted to share a few things we've learned during that time. One is really ensuring the continuous access to schools and education during armed conflict really requires a coalition. It's a coalition that requires political will at the top level, but it also requires to get an engagement with the armed forces very often, armed groups, that dialogue. It also requires communities to trust us and engage with us and trust that the place can be safe and that children can actually go there. It also, in some cases, requires some referral mechanisms so that children who are identified with other issues can actually be helped as well. And again, the Colombia program done with IOM and the government of Colombia is quite interesting in that respect. We've also learned that, obviously, the vulnerabilities of children really increase when children are displaced, whether they're internally displaced or they're refugees. So it is really a category of students that need to be given special attention. In 2020, just over half of the refugee children were in schools, actually. So that means the other half wasn't in shape or form in schools. And that really appreciating the points made by the Polish Deputy Prime Minister about the effort done in Poland. But again, it's an effort done in many other countries, as the SR, as you mentioned, welcoming refugees, but that's not quite enough. What we know also is that we often, when children cannot go to school, we always often think about distance learning. We often think about different ways to actually bring, and in the case of the response in Ukraine, it plays an important role. Yet we know that the most vulnerable and the poorest are the ones that will not have access to education like that. They will not have access to electricity, to internet, and so we always need to think also of low-tech options, such as paper options. And we're doing, for example, in Syria, we've been doing for some time the radio in northeast Nigeria or in Cameroon, which is so important. But of course, at the same time, we should continue investing in some other digital learning opportunities. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, as we do that, and when we do that, we need to realize that actually that does not replace a child being in the school. It helps for a while, but it doesn't. Really, it's, we've learned that very much with the COVID response, that the learning in the kind of environment is nowhere near what actually the school can provide, also because the school provides all these other advantages as well. And then, of course, we always realize that, unfortunately, very often in our emergency response, education is not very well funded or not very well supported, not necessarily really seen as a humanitarian response or central. I have to salute not because you're there, but I have to salute the effort that ECHO has been doing over the years in really committing more resources towards education. That's really important and appreciated. I think there's been great progress on that. I remember when I started my career, we had to convince that education was part of humanitarian response. Now it's there, but it's still quite marginal in the kind of support and funding. So education cannot wait even in those crises, but many of these crises really last a long time. So just to finish, we obviously, as UNICEF, we try to do our part and find different ways to be creative. And I just want to maybe turn to member states here with 3 little recommendations very rapidly. One, to help us maintain safe access to schools during armed conflict, which is reduce the risk of attacks. Obviously help us through delivering through other means when that's possible. Secondly, of course, support the uninterrupted learning for every child affected by the crisis, whether they're girls, children with disabilities, refugees, IDPs. Make sure that we do not forget them. Again, there's been great work on that, but there are many cases where it's not quite the case. And it does very often actually require a distinct approach that actually caters for the specific needs of these particular groups. And then finally, of course, to take concrete steps to adopt and implement the Safe Schools Declaration and use your power and your clout to actually influence parties to conflict to do the right thing when it comes to education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Fontaine, an aspect I particularly liked was the wish of children going back to school. I think this is something that we've really seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the aspect you mentioned also with digital and schools, it cannot replace it, but sometimes it's very important to give them the access. I'm now inviting the Deputy Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the UN, Ambassador Dik Suleimani. She's an expert on human rights. I read in your bio. Now, I will not say anything anymore about the years of experience. I already skipped, obviously.
a softball.
Yeah. But I see from your bio that you are an expert on gender issues, human rights issues, also disabilities. You have held positions in your own MFA back in your capital, and you were also once responsible for the African Union and the African continent. Please, you have the floor.
I want to thank you all, and let me just on existing protocols, since I have 5 minutes to say so much, so I will try to see how much of a magician I'll be. And that said, I want to thank UNICEF and the Mission of Poland and the European Union Delegation for putting this together. It could not have been more apt. It is very laudable, and I thank you for the invite. So today, I have the honor to speak on behalf of my country. I am here to tell the Sierra Leonean story on what the impact of conflict on education looks like. Because most of you present in this room will tell that my country went through one of the fiercest and bloodiest civil conflicts of our times in the 1990s, and it lasted for 12 good years. And I saw everything firsthand. I left Sierra Leone in 2004 when the war was declared officially over in 2002. So I am not telling a story. I saw it firsthand. So I am going to divide my presentation into parts. The first part, I will give a brief history, and then how we dealt with it, and how we are dealing with it. And I'm not going to leave behind the epidemic and the pandemic, because they are all crisis situations, and how their effect on the education system in Sierra Leone. What I hear people say, distant learning, we did not have that luxury during the civil war in Sierra Leone because of the brutality that accompanied that conflict. Everybody was running for their life. You will not even remember to go to school. Children were disconnected from their parents. Girls were raped in an unimaginable way. Gang raping of girls. So the impact was great. So I will say quickly that I want to state that the devastating nature of the Civil War took the nation's education system as an early casualty. The warring factions attacked schools and colleges and razed them to the ground with explosives, arson, and gunfire. In many instances, the attackers directly targeted students and education personnel with force of threat, including sexual violence, forced conscription of young children, and even forced marriage and sexual slavery. So, as the war became protracted and violent, armed forces, law enforcement, and other state security entities and non-state armed groups started using schools and college facilities in regions under their control for military purposes. So how is that going to be possible for any educational activity? So sometimes the schools and colleges will be used to force children to join their groups to fight. These attacks had devastating impact on the human lives and our educational system and long-term peace, and it's really protracted as we speak. So in 2013, only 13% of schools around the country were deemed usable after 12 years of conflict. Many of them were reduced to rubble. In 2004, records show that only over 60% of our country's schools still needed major repairs or complete reconstruction. And over 2 million people were said to be displaced, both internally and externally, including myself speaking to you. So we are talking about 1/3 of the population of the country at that time. And then the war also led to huge exodus of teachers, lecturers, and even, of course, when you leave, you won't leave your child. So again, no opportunity for education. So with the arrival of peacekeepers, many of our teacher training colleges and other education facilities that still needed to be reconstructed serve as temporary station for the peacekeepers. So they use them as their duty post. So 12 years after the end of the war, we are still grappling with the relics of that war, and then Ebola struck. No opportunity again for education. Fast forward, 2020, March, I think it was March 31st, when the first case was in Sierra Leone was recorded of the COVID-19 pandemic. That one again came, no opportunity for education, because we had just signed the agreement for the GIGA initiative, that is an initiative by UNICEF and ITU and other partners to get schools connected but then we had not even started, and still we are just at the level of mapping. Most of the schools are not connected in any shape or form. So with all of this background, I will look at what we did as a country in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the normative measures we adopted, and of course with the support of the international community, including the UN and its agencies, and of course our development partners. We undertook certain things. We enacted legislations. We endorsed international normative frameworks like the Paris Commitment to protect children from recruitment in armed forces. And then we enacted the Child Rights Act, which is a domestication of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that the enlistment of children in armed conflict was criminalized by that legislation. And then we moved to the stage of disarmament, the mobilization and reintegration of the ex-combatants, including the children, most of whom we tried to reunite with their families. And then, of course, we found safe homes for those who were disconnected from their parents, and the street children, those who were orphaned by the conflicts. All of that we had to deal with. And of course, we tried to get support so that there will be some form of reparation for the victims, including their children. Then for the girls that were raped, we looked into the issue of trauma healing and psychosocial counseling, so that they can go back to school. That is, those who are not yet past the age of school going, we are encouraged to go back. And of course, all of this we are done with the national institution that was responsible for that, the Ministry of Social Welfare. And then we started looking into the issue of ending violence against women, because that is one thing that keeps girls from going to school. So we enacted, again, we amended the Sexual Offences Act to increase punishment for perpetrators of rape to 15 years. And then we a life jail term for those who sexually penetrate minors. Sierra Leone's president is one of the presidents that declared a state of emergency on rape, to show that he is determined to put that issue to permanently fix SGBV. So when he did, they thought he was so radical, but he escalated it to the amendment of the Sexual Offences Act, and then other measures and campaigns, one of which is led by the First Lady of Sierra Leone, known as the Hands of Our Girls. That campaign deals with so many thematic areas in favor of protecting the girl child, rape, early or forced marriage, and it's even dealing with menstrual hygiene, providing free sanitary pads. All of these measures to end violence against women and girls was meant to not only increase the enrollment of girls in school, but to retain them and for them to complete schooling, because that was a privilege. Most of the girls, when raped, stigma, and then they will find it difficult to go back to school. Pregnant girls initially were not allowed to continue education, but then that ban has now been lifted, so we are making progress. So fast forward COVID, we decided to adopt other strategies so that we can get our children online and be ready for the fourth industrial revolution. Because what happened in COVID, we don't want it to happen, because that will just disrupt our education and the generation will be lost. And then after having adopted all of those measures, with the help of the international community, the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission made recommendations in favor of protecting the child, and then the special court that was set up to bring to book all those who bear the greatest responsibilities for the atrocities that went through during the conflict and other issues. We decided to invest in education, because we knew that education has proven to contribute greatly to the productivity of citizens and economic development. So we prioritize human capital development through our free quality education. And we did not only make it free, we made it quality, and then made it compulsory for elementary school, so no child should be at home. We have criminalized that one. And then we have therefore based this approach and our approach to education on the core principles of universal access, radical inclusion, quality learning, and comprehensive safety. I will quickly, I've seen you moving your hands to stop, so let me quickly move to the challenges. I have so much to say. So despite the fact that the country has experienced notable advances and improvements from initial damage left by the war, education in Sierra Leone continues to struggle with the school system and the difficult task of rebuilding school, training teachers, and educating children. So all of that, those things have resource implication, and to get our schools connected, internet access is not yet that strong, and all of those. And then of course the militarizing children was, some of them were forced to move to other conflict zones. That report I saw when I was a third committee expert. It was an SG's report, wherein a child from Sierra Leone left the country and went to Liberia to fight. When the war was over in Liberia, he moved. And when he was interviewed, he said that is what he has learned to do. So he didn't have education at his disposal. But that one was to be verified. Of course, few recommendations. I agree with the Safe Schools Declaration that has been mentioned by everybody. And of course, Sierra Leone has endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. And we also want to recommend that as we brace up for the Transforming Education Summit, we want that initiative by UNICEF, ITU, and other partners, to that GIGA initiative to get all schools around the world connected, to be given prominence during the Transforming Education Summit. And fortunately, the Minister for Basic and Senior Secondary Education, the indefatigable David Senge, is co-chair of the Secretary General's Advisory Committee for the Transforming Education Summit. So let me round up by saying, in all of this, we must pay attention to ending violence against children. We must pay attention to ex-combatants and getting them reunited with their families and ensuring that they are back in school, because they are vulnerable. There is the tendency of them to be lynched. They are considered as murderers. They did this under influence, some under drug. And then we should address the issue of small arms and light weapons. I have a host of recommendations that I don't have the luxury of time to highlight. But I want to say thank you, and I will call upon all our partners, those who have stood with Sierra Leone, to help us ensure continuation of education post-COVID. I thank you for your attention.
Committees between the third and the second committee, and on issues such as the implementation of the 2030 agenda, global health issues, but also the Rohingya, as RSG just also mentioned in her remarks, the challenges the Rohingyas were facing, moving to your country. I would ask you to be short. Because we are running late, but please, you have
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Let me begin by thanking the delegation of EU and also the Permanent Mission of Poland for organizing this very timely meeting. I would suggested I would make it short, but of course, Bangladesh, on behalf of Bangladesh, I would like to share the experiences of providing education to children in crisis. You know that Bangladesh is currently hosting over 1 million of Rohingya Muslims who have been victims of state-led persecution in a complex ethno-minority situation in Myanmar. The majority of the Rohingyas are currently living in one of our southern coastal towns, Cox's Bazar, most of them, but some of them have already transferred to another place, less than 10%. And out of the total Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh, more than 50% are actually women and children. So you can imagine how big would be the children portion of the refugees. So providing them education is not a very easy task. Still, with the support of the international community as well as local stakeholders in Bangladesh, our government is trying to provide learning facilities to the Rohingya children. So I'll share some of the experience from that provision. We must remember that the context of Cox's Bazar camp is different from other situations that we have been discussing. Because the term continuation of education actually does not apply to the Rohingya children, because they are not privy to education in their own country, in the Rakhine state. So it is quite different from other situations. And another important context is due to the decade-long disenfranchisement and lack of education, the community becomes a little conservative. So they are actually not very willing to take education, because, and also the child marriage, polygamy and other harmful practices are quite prevalent, which add complexity to the situation. In any case, the government of Bangladesh has been extremely conscious of the need to provide good education, kind of education, because we have learned from the UNICEF director that this actually provides some benefits for the future success in their life. While doing that, we also keep in mind that we have to see them repatriated to their own country so that they can be reintegrated into their society. So that is our ultimate aim. So I will now very briefly tell what are the types of learning facilities we are providing to them. There are three kinds of learning facilities we are now providing. One is called the Learning Competency Framework Approach, which is jointly being developed by UNICEF and one of the largest NGOs, Bangladeshi NGOs, BRAC. You may know, many of you may know the name. So under the framework, there are 4 stages of level of learning, and the subjects include, like other countries, science, math, English, and Burmese language, of course, and the basic life skills, and also the health and psychosocial health provision, and there are the protection issues we are teaching them there. So this is mostly for the adolescent children. And the second one is actually, last year we have also commissioned a pilot project. We call it Myanmar Curriculum Pilot, or MCP. That is rolled out in the Rohingya camps, which actually follows the Myanmar curriculum and is conducted primarily in the Myanmar language. So that also causes some challenges for us, because we need, since this education is provided fully free of charge, and we requested the voluntary support from the Rohingya camps. So it is sometimes very difficult to find out the voluntary or willing person who want to do the education. So we are also at the same time trying to recruit our own nationals who can teach the Myanmar language. So that is a time-consuming process, but we are sincerely trying to do that. The reason why we are trying to teach them in Myanmar language, because we think, as I have mentioned earlier, that it will facilitate reintegration into their ancestral society in Rakhine state, and of course after their voluntary return. Besides this, as I have mentioned, that some of them are becoming very conservative about taking education, and also there are some children who are disabled, or some children who doesn't have any care or support at home. So they cannot come to this kind of semi-formal school. So we have actually developed another kind of less semi-formal, I would say, education that is called the community-based learning center. So that is the third type of learning facilities that we are providing. And these community-based learning centers is actually can be operated during the emergencies or even during the disaster. So that is one good thing for the disabled people who cannot go to the distant places to learn. And I have mentioned already about the teachers. Teachers are mostly volunteering from the Rohingya people, and we are also recruiting our own nationals. And what are the challenges? So while doing so, there remain more challenges. And of course, the number one challenge is the COVID-19 pandemic. As everywhere in the world, education comes to a pause. So that is true for not only for the Rohingya camps, but as well as for the rest of the people in Bangladesh. So that actually hampered a little bit of the education facilities to the Rohingya children. But with the situation getting better now, the schools are reopened as in the plain land. So the Rohingya camps schools are full and running now. Second major challenge is the resource mobilization. There is a need to increase resources for the training of teachers, we call it TOT, and for the development of teaching materials, books, and other infrastructural logistics. Of course, we believe that the international community will respond to the calls by the UNICEF and other CSO partners and provide them with necessary support so that this program can be continued for as long as they remain in Bangladesh. And finally, the point I wish to highlight here, I'm going very quickly so that I can save some time. The point I wish to highlight here is that we are concerned that without any hope of safe and sustainable return, I want to reiterate again, without any hope of safe and sustainable return to their own motherland, of course in Myanmar, it will be impossible to prevent the Rohingya children from becoming a lost generation, the word that are used in the theme of the topic today, theme of the meeting today. So what the Rohingya children need is to be able to return to their own country with rights, dignities, and opportunities so that they can pursue a stable future for themselves and contribute to the peace and development of Myanmar, a country they call home. We cannot, of course, afford to lose sight of the main issue and must continue our collective efforts with all international partners, community, EU, United States, Unicef, UN agencies, and with the UN Secretariat, to facilitate an early, sustainable, and voluntary repatriation of the Rohingya to their ancestral land in Rakhine state of Myanmar. That should be their ultimate destination. I thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hossein. And now it's a pleasure for me to give the floor to Yassine Sharif, Director from Education in Africa. I'm impressed by the list of countries in which you have served. I think you touched upon nearly all the continents, from Afghanistan to Bosnia, Montenegro, but also Cambodia, an Asian country, and then a couple of African countries, including then also the Middle East, New York and Geneva. You have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all of you, and thank you to the Permanent Mission of Poland, the European Union, the Permanent Mission of the EU, and UNICEF, and the host of education cannot wait, and the Office of the SRG for Children in Armed Conflict. Very quickly for all of you to know, what is Education Cannot Wait? Well, it was established by the former Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown, during the World Humanitarian Summit, in collaboration with UNICEF, other UN agencies, and many member states to the UN, including the United Kingdom, United States, and others. And we are a pooled funding mechanism that serves the entire UN system and civil society, and work with host governments to bring more funding in for education in situations of emergencies and true target crisis. And we are graciously hosted by UNICEF here in New York. So thank you very much also for inviting us. Yesterday, and I would really recommend to all of you, I visited the exhibition as you go in through the visitor's entrance, and I think it was on display by Norway and the Office of the Special Representative to the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, where you see the pictures of children from armed conflict. And what was interesting was to see how, and they have gone through tremendous human suffering. Tremendous. I mean, it's hard to hold back your tears when you see the pictures and you read their stories. But the majority of them, they were saying, education is our only hope. It's our only hope. And that's why education in emergencies and protracted conflict and crisis is so essential. Because without it, we cannot achieve sustainable development goals. How do we achieve gender equality if girls do not go to school? How do we end extreme poverty if you can't read and write? And so forth and so forth. Education is really the foundation. It should be its own separate foundational sustainable development goal. And I'm a human rights lawyer by training. I have worked for the UN since the late 80s. But I can say with absolute conviction that without education, you cannot reclaim or claim your human rights. It's the very fundamental key that will turn all other rights into realization. So it's very, very important. And I'm glad that we are discussing today. So those left furthest behind is precisely the children and the youth in armed conflict, climate-induced disasters, in forced displacement, refugee internally displaced. They are the ones left furthest behind. If among all the 1.5 billion children who suffered through COVID-19, there are about 200 million who suffered well before that, who did not have access to remote learning, iPads, computers, who were sitting in their refugee camps, who were being chased away from the villages or being burnt out, saw the parents being raped and murdered on top of COVID-19. They are the ones. And if these approximated 200 million children and youth today do never access a quality education, it's going to impact all of us. It will be on the doorstep. Here, in New York, in Europe, everywhere, it will impact all of us. And most of all, our own conscience. I know I don't want to speak too long, but I'll let you know that we work very closely with UNICEF and other agencies in countries like Afghanistan, the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, closely with your government, South Sudan, the Sahel, Cameroon, Uganda, the Venezuelan refugees. Wherever there's a crisis, Education Cannot Wait is working together with UNICEF and others to make sure that we can increase the financing. And as Manuel Fontaine from UNICEF said, there's been some increase over the past 5 years, but we need to put that as priority. And I will conclude by saying, I should mention, since we are here, also to thank Poland for the great generosity that you have shown to refugees from Ukraine. Education Cannot Wait has invested $5 million just weeks after the conflict broke out, working with the cluster, UNICEF, Save the Children, and the Ministry of Education in Ukraine. And we also had a joint mission to Moldova just a few weeks ago, where we also invested $1.5 million for joint programming. Everything we do is in line with Secretary General's reform. And I will conclude, because I realize we're running over time. We are investing in 42 crisis conflict countries, climate and youth disaster countries. And what we are appealing to you, the Secretary General's Transforming Education Summit is coming up. It's a historical moment to really put education as a top priority for the United Nations to achieve Sustainable Development Goals and human rights. And it is the top priority for us to put those left furthest behind on the agenda of that summit. And you as member states, as UN colleagues, and we are discussing this also internally, but to put those left furthest behind, Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, Ukraine, make them the center for the Transformative Education Summit of the Secretary General and the other approximately 200 million children who are running for their lives as we sit here and speak today. Don't forget the children in armed conflict and climate and youth disasters. They need us more than ever. Thank you.
Many thanks for a very passionate remarks. And with that, I would like to give the floor to our host today, to Ambassador Mateusz Sakowicz. Please, you have the floor. I'd just like to remind you again about the I have a plane to catch, just also to
The pressure is on, madam.
The pressure is on, please.
Thank you so much. It's obviously extremely challenging to contribute with anything after such a spectacular lineup of speakers. But let me just underscore how privileged and honored we are to have you all here today and to have this discussion on a very timely and pertinent issue. Let me also mention that for years now, Poland has been trying, hopefully somewhat successfully, to speak up on behalf of those particularly vulnerable, being the children, women, people with disabilities, religious minorities. That had been our priority when we served at the Security Council. But we try to move the ball forward as they speak and try to continue on this path. Having said that, of course, everything these days when I think about education, my home country is perceived to be ongoing war and its consequences. And the Deputy Prime Minister has spoken at length and actually used all the best points that they had to deliver today. So I'll try to be brief. One point that I wanted to make, however, connected directly with the ongoing crisis, is that what we should keep in mind is also the schools are the direct target of the invasion. So in times of war, classrooms can and should provide children with a sense of stability and act as a safe space to learn and to process their trauma, something that Director Fontaine speak at length, and I fully subscribe to that. However, across Ukraine, schools have been destroyed in Russian shelling and airstrikes. Many classrooms are simply unusable after being damaged or fully destroyed. And now, even after the war is over, it will take still a long time to rebuild the school infrastructure and other educational facilities. That's something we should keep in mind. Maybe I should also touch upon one issue where the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland left off. Namely, we heard quite detailed information with regard to primary and secondary education that we strive to provide. Yet there is also higher level education. And with this regard, we also try to do our utmost. So students who are pursuing their higher education in Ukraine before the outbreak of war are welcome in Poland and can continue their education. So are actually some professors. I don't want to give you the exact number because I hope the number will increase, but they are also enabled to continue their career and teach ultimately the others. They are enabled to study free in students charge, and they are also in a position to receive an allowance. Certain tuitions are reimbursed. At the end of the day, they can also apply for the rector's scholarship, social scholarship, and student loan. And without being too long and touching upon one point that Director Sharif expressed, she underscored that development depends very much on education. I would extrapolate that thought also to other aspects, be it directly linked to education when I think about it. We worldwide pursue now the goals of lifelong education, continued education, and also knowledge-based economy. If we lose this year or two, that's as Madam Special Representative mentioned, right? That translates into like 2 decades. That's something that, from what I hear, is irreversible. So that's something to be conscious of, I believe. As knowledge-based economy is also comprised of human capital. And that's the massive risk that we are facing, that basically this element will be out of the equation. And just the very final sentence, coming myself from the security policy background, I also fully subscribe to the notion that education is one of the best means at our disposal, also the best tools at our disposal to counter radicalization, violent extremism, terrorism, and at the end of the day, to prevent conflict. I thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. I need to excuse the SRSG who had to brief the Security Council Sanctions Committee now at 3 p.m. and so she needed to leave. With that, I would like to open the floor. I have a list of colleagues who asked for the floor. Yeah, the first one left already, so I would now try to give the floor to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Australia. He left also, okay. The German mission, do we have them here? Thomas left. Well, that's easy, huh? The next one is the Bishop of Malta, left. No, he's here, very good. So all our hopes on Malta. Francesca, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for Polish missions, the EU and all the speakers. I will of course not take long because I know time is not on our side. But of course, this is a very important, the CAC mandate is a very important priority for us. We know that there are collective benefits for persons when they are given access to quality education, but also that with education there's also literacy. And also as my colleague from Polish Mission mentioned, that it's all about giving them the skills to be able to decipher, to understand, and information that is available, and to give them the skills what they can do. And like this, we can counter radicalization, extremism, anything apart from, as Unicef said, a very safe environment, because school is not only education, it is much more than that. Of course, as we've heard, girls are disproportionately impacted, and also very much usually the last ones to get back to the education cycle. And of course, our shared legal and moral responsibility to guarantee the right to education must be at the forefront of all our actions. And just to conclude, these events are great. It's great to be in person again. It's great to have these exchanges, because through these exchanges we support the CAC mandate. We hear about what's happening in particular situations on the ground. We've heard about Sierra Leone, we've heard about Bangladesh, and that so much is being done, and there's so much again to do. But you can count on Malta's support. Thank you.
Excellent, many thanks. Francesca, I'm going through the list I have in front of me. I have the Swiss mission, Andrea Baumann.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Excellencies, colleagues. We would like to thank the conveners and panelists for focusing our attention in a really compelling way on the urgency of ensuring education in emergencies. About 35 million children are displaced today, and half of them do not go to school, and we heard the many lasting and far-reaching consequences of that. And as the Deputy Prime Minister and the other speakers also outlined, parties to a conflict continue to make education the target of attacks in far too many places, including in Afghanistan, in Yemen, Myanmar, the Horn of Africa, as well as during the ongoing Russian military aggression against Ukraine. And in all conflicts, Switzerland strongly condemns all attacks against education in violation of international law. And education in emergencies is a priority for Switzerland. We provide policy and operational support for education in conflict and crisis-affected countries. And we are also committed to integrating forcibly displaced children in our own national school system. And this is currently the case, for example, with newly arriving children from Ukraine. The importance of education in emergencies is clear, and yet education appeals receive less than 2% of humanitarian funding. More is needed. I think that was made very clear today as well, and that is why Switzerland is partnering with Education Cannot Wait. And it's very good to see the director on the panel, and thank you for your remarks. And we will co-host together a high-level financing conference in Geneva in February 2023 with Germany and Norway as co-conveners to raise additional funds for quality education in emergency and protected crisis. And I would just like to close with a point that has been made very powerfully, I think, today, that for a child, continuing his or her education in times of crisis is synonymous with survival and protection and hope, and we will continue to work with partners at the UN and beyond to make this a reality for children everywhere. So thank you very much.
Many thanks to Switzerland. I have a prominent representative of Latvia who asked for the floor, and then a couple of more colleagues here. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank the host for organizing on this event. It will be very, very brief. Of course, full support from Latvia to Unicef and to all the UN agencies dealing with this very, very burning subject. And of course, coming from the Baltics, we face the largest influx of displaced people since World War II. In Latvia, more than 30,000 for a country of 1.9 million people. And of course, our minds primarily with Ukraine, with Moldova, with countries dealing with this issue. And of course, children are in the focus of our efforts since they are about the largest group of displaced people coming. Full support on the points about access to education. Of course, Afghanistan, Myanmar should not be forgotten. And I want to amplify what Francesca from Malta just said. Looking from the Baltics, we put particular emphasis on media and information literacy. I think the resolution which was adopted last year by acclamation in GA, Adult Information Media Literacy Week, is a good foundation. online, offline. During the COVID pandemic, we have seen how disinformation, how poisonous it is. It's literally killing people. And now during aggression as well, we see that this is really should be one of the. Keeping in mind the digital gap, still we believe that information media literacy should be a priority. Latvia is an advisory committee of the summit in September, so we stand ready to contribute in all possible way. Thank you.
Many thanks. I have the communication of Ukraine to the UN, the colleague, yes, still here. Natalia Mundanko, please.
Hello. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for organizing this event, and especially thanks to Poland and U-Mission and UNICEF for all your efforts and hospitality and generosity to our children, which are the most asset for every nation. And of course, we're doing everything to protect them from being lost, to ensure their happy future, and education is a key part of this. I will be very short. Just taking this opportunity, I would like to highlight that the Ministry of Education of Ukraine tracking all the damages as lost to educational facilities and on e-portal, and you may also track its education under attack on the website of our ministry. As for now, more than 1,584 educational facilities are damaged and 118 completely destroyed. So it's the losses just in 2 months is unimaginable. More than among 4 million students and pupils, today 3.5 million has resumed their studies. Of course, it's more on remote and distance mode. And actually, due to COVID pandemic, we have facilitated digital technologies, and now we can ensure the online education for them, and our ministry also open the platforms for online education. The second point that I want to mention that the ministry also crafted a set of priority projects to be developed, and it could be also found on the website in special chapter Ukraine support to education and science in wartime. So please follow the website because the ensuring continuity of education is an absolutely top priority for us as well. Thank you so much.
I still have 3 countries on my list. Maybe there's some volunteers for skipping the floor. I have Denmark, Niger, and Georgia. Any volunteers for not taking the floor? And then I have 2 persons from the same. They're not here. Very good. In this case, very good. So the time
is here, but I will be very brief. I just want
Georgia.
I just want to express our full solidarity to Ukraine and condemn in strongest possible way the Russian aggression and the ongoing war against Ukraine. We stand next to you.
Thank you very much. The political message is well heard and well received. I have 2 colleagues from Save the Children, and I would propose that just one speaks. No, and then I have Bethany Ellis from Watchlist on Children and on Conflict. Very good. Okay. Well, with that, I think we've heard some extremely interesting messages. Children as a weapon of arms. I think this is a weapon of war. This is really one thing that I'm keeping in my mind. Any attempt to violate international humanitarian law, very important as well. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Silvio Mondato, who with his team organized this
Thank you, Christina, and indeed thank you to the Polish mission for hosting us, and thank you to all the briefers, in particular my colleagues Vic and Manuel. I really appreciate you being here, and Yasmin and Manuel, we really appreciate your interventions. I'll be very, very brief. I'm conscious of the time. I just think that the first message I wanted to address to this audience is that we haven't discovered the problem of education in conflict now because of the war in Ukraine. Quite the contrary, as Manuel was saying already at the time of the war in Syria. I remember colleagues in ECHO realizing the importance of continuing to provide education for these children, ensuring that they are not a lost generation. If you think that 11 years have gone by, it's an entire school cycle. It's quite crazy. And I also was quite struck by the fact that schools are the place where we achieve the sustainable development goals and where we fulfill the basic human rights of individuals. So I think it's a very important and powerful message. I also see education as a key element for transition to peace and stability, to break the cycles of conflict. And I think the attacks on schools, the denial of education is a denial of the identity of a country, the identity of a people, and the denial of dignity, the dignity of girls, for example. I think it's a very important message. What happens in Afghanistan, what happened in Nigeria with Boko Haram is shameful. So I hope with this event we contributed to raising awareness about the issue, reinvigorating our determination to tackle it, providing additional political support to the Office of the Special Representative, but also providing the necessary financial support to the activities that, in particular, also UNICEF carries out, with our strong support in close partnership with UNICEF, and also to ensure that the Transforming Education Summit has this issue, the issue of education in conflict situations, right at the forefront. Thank you very much for coming on a Friday afternoon. Much appreciated. Bye-bye. And I forgot to thank my colleagues, Isvi, Beniz, and Yelena for organizing this, and the trainees who helped us. Thank you.
Many thanks, and with that I close this event. Very inspiring for me. I take many good ideas back to Brussels with me, and enjoy your Friday afternoon and your weekend.